for greater governmental action, if that makes sense. So the business case for government action. So we'll be hearing from both sides of that, but I don't want to make it about sides. It's all about pushing together in the same direction, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So before I say anything more, let me introduce you to Matthias Leliev, CEO of Engie Impact, who've played such an important role in making this event possible. Engie Impact was launched to accelerate sustainability transformation for corporations, cities, and governments all over the world. So, Matthias.
Thank you. Thanks to Climate Group, Climate Week, to give us a chance to kick off these finale sessions this afternoon. Great conversation to come. And I just wanted to share four learnings from what I've been hearing so far, being in all those conversations since Monday. And first is really, when we talk about this notion of sustainability transformation and this call for action, I remember at the opening, one of the panelists saying, just do it. Actually, it's pretty hard to do it and just do it. It's very complex. If you start to think about just the complexity across, energy, water, or you manage your material or waste on one side, and then you expand that to a global scale, how do you get action at speed and at scale? And that complexity is out there, definitely out there. And it's not because there's no willingness to move forward. It's just super difficult. And then out of that, come on the conversation, this idea of while we are, engaging on that journey to lead and act on this transformation, sustainability transformation, the ability to have more and more access to actionable data, making the right choices, the right priorities, the right investments is going to be even more critical than in the past. That's my first thoughts. Second one is really that change that we are talking about, that real transformation. It's not only about technical capabilities, not only about shifting to renewable energy. It's actually a massive undertaking and transformation that need to touch every part of the organization. And so the ability to drive that transformation throughout your organization is critical. And again, it's not about just do it. It's difficult to do, leading that type of change. But guess what? The good news is that the energy is out there. Your employee base, your people are excited and are going to be excited by that transformation. Everybody wants to do good to the planet. Nobody wants to harm the planet while you are with your operations. The energy is out there. The question is, how do you continue to energize those communities, surf on those energies, and really build on that to really lead that transformation? So not only technical, really a change, a transformation that need to be led in those different organizations. The third one is really around, we have all those technologies that are already there today that allow us to imagine a path for an affordable sustainability transformation. But then we know that there are some new challenges out there, challenges in the future. And when I think about transportation, really at that intersection of energy players, OEM, cities, that complexity, how do we continue to have the conversation here and expand those conversations so that we can build those coalitions around the next challenges? Because we need more to actually solve that at scale and at speed. And the last one is I was thinking about is we're talking all day around actions, but we're having conversations. That's great. Let's have conversation. But how do we translate that into real action when we go back to our organizations? What's your plan when you go back to your organization to actually act and make that transformation happening? I know what I'm going back to my organization. I want to expand my advisory board to get the outside in, as we were shared this morning during our panel. I want to do that. I want to, and I will, make sure that I'm going to challenge my organization because we have the chance to serve global organizations and cities. How do we make those connections? How do we make those connections better? And third is really to continue to put at the core of my organization our purpose, to make sustainability happen today, at the core of everything we do. And really, by the end of the year, come with that new cultural transformation from our organization. So I would like to send you the challenge. What are the actions that you are coming back to your organization? Because conversations are great, but it's time to action at speed and at scale. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, thank you very much. So this afternoon we're talking about businesses and we're talking about NDCs, and I've just thrown a piece of jargon in there, which half of you are like, yeah, I know what you're talking about, and the other half are thinking, oh, you've already lost me. So I thought we'd start the whole event with a jargon buster. Those of you who know this stuff, just have a few minutes to yourself. Go to your happy place, which is maybe the UN or something. But for the rest of us, just thought it'd be useful to make sure that we all speak roughly the same language. So this is your primer, which isn't moving. What do I point this at? There we go. So that's your first one, UNFCCC. That is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You'll hear that a lot, usually called the UNFCCC. That was signed, that's the original convention on climate change, signed back in 1992. For those of you who are new to this, surprised to learn that people have been doing this for a very long time. We've known what the problem is. That's a whole other topic, why it's taken us so long. But that's the framework convention that sets the whole story going. Every year, the parties to that convention come together at something that we handily call the COP, the Conference of the Parties. That's what that stands for. So if you're wondering why climate people talk on and on about the COP, that's what they're going to. They're going to a meeting of all the people who've signed up to the UNFCCC. And those get numbered, because we're not very original in the climate space. And the 21st, COP21, was held in Paris, and it's slightly giving you away. What do you think got signed there? Yes, the Paris Agreement. So that's where that name comes from. COP21, 2015, an agreement, and in that agreement was that everyone would pursue efforts to get well below 2 degrees C of warming and pursue efforts to reach 1.5 degrees C. And the mechanism by which we would do this is what we're going to be talking a lot about today, which are the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. I'm trying to do this all while not looking at a climate negotiator sitting in the front row. Broadly right? Spot on. So the NDCs, those are your pieces of jargon, UNFCCC, COP, Paris Agreement, and the NDCs. And the reason those are significant is that they need to be renewed every 5 years. So if you add 21 and 5, you get 26. They'll be being renewed at COP26. That is taking place in 2020, and that is taking place in Glasgow, in the UK. Not, as apparently our Prime Minister said yesterday, England. Glasgow, it's happening in. Then there's a process between now and then by which that revision happens, and we might hear a lot more about that later today, about exactly what that process is. That is your jargon buster. Does everyone feel that they now know, every time someone says NDCs, what on earth we might be talking about? Good. Happy faces. So this afternoon event is all about how we get that ambition up. We want to talk about how much corporate action and corporate action on the climate has increased since those NDCs were set 5 years ago, how business has influenced Paris, huge role since then and in the run-up to Paris, and how we now want the business community to come together to work with national governments to put pressure on their increased ambition as we go into the next 15 months. And that's really what we're going to be talking about for the next few hours. We're going to have the COP25. So I've thrown COP26 in there. COP26 happening next year, so this year, COP25. That'll be happening in Santiago in Chile in December. And the COP25 climate champion, Gonzalo Muñoz, will be coming and talking to us. And we have Archie Young from the UK, who will be talking to us about COP26. So we can see how this process is going to play out over the next 15 months. And then the other thing that I have to introduce is this bit of technology here, Vivox. This is where you can ask questions and let your presence be known via the medium of technology, which is great. So I believe you go to just vivox.app on your phones. So you've got a great excuse for looking at your phones. And then you throw in this meeting ID, and that will allow you to participate in various questions and polls that we're going to ask over the course of the afternoon. So please do go along there, otherwise it'll just be the climate group people voting, and that will skew everything, although it will skew in the direction of ambition at least. So I believe that is all the intros done. People feeling like they know what we're talking about, know how we're going to talk about it. Good. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Secretary Ernest Moniz, who is the former US Secretary of Energy from 2013 to 2017, and currently the founder and CEO of Energy Futures Initiative. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Helen, and also thanks for this invitation. But a little bit of a curveball now that you've had this little dictionary kind of session. I think I'm going to amplify a little bit on that first. In particular, you mentioned the UNFCCC and 1992, Rio de Janeiro. It's actually, I think, an interesting observation that is very seldom made. The United States Senate ratified that as a treaty in 1992. With the obligation to address anthropogenic drivers of climate, but at that time in 1992, without the numbers. Paris filled in the numbers, at least a first set of numbers. I think it's worth keeping in mind. Technically, the law of the United States is that we will address anthropogenic climate change. Secondly, that again takes us to NDCs, as you mentioned, as kind of the first round of numbers, and coming out of Paris. I do want to note that, and we'll come back to this later, while the Paris Agreement, by definition, was the last day of COP21, a reminder, or perhaps a new statement to you, is on the first day of COP21, which the French cleverly arranged to have as the day in which national leaders would come, as opposed to what happened in Copenhagen when they came on the last day. They came on the first day and also signed an agreement, which I'm not going to press the point, but I would not be embarrassed to be given the debating position that it was a more important agreement than the one signed on the last day of COP21. Namely, it was the commitment to mission innovation, in which innovation, technology innovation, was placed internationally at the core of climate solutions. And frankly, I'll say right now, I'm going to come back to this, I do not believe that there is a solution for our 2050 goals and aspirations that does not involve major breakthroughs of new technologies. We'll come back and discuss that, but I believe there is a happy talk fallacy developing that somehow we have everything we need. And again, I'm mixing up my messages coming forward, but I think it's worth saying it now. And that's partly because we tend to channel our comments into carbon-free electricity. And that's great for the 25% of emissions that come from electricity. It's not so great for the 75% in other sectors that are much more difficult to decarbonize, which is why I say I'm happy to say we have the technologies in principle to manage the electricity system with reasonable amounts of storage, but we don't have it for economy-wide. But anyway, so that's a little story driven by your dictionary discussion, where, again, we have a law in the United States to address it. We don't, however, in my view, have the technologies long-term. Now, Having said it's the law does not change the fact that President Trump said we're leaving the Paris Agreement just over a couple of years ago. And within days, it was very important that many governors and mayors of big cities, now I'm talking here domestically, but of course it's also true internationally that mayors, for example, and subnational leaders are very committed. In the United States, certainly our climate policies, if you like, are essentially at least the explicit ones are strictly at the subnational level, at the state level, typically, whereas we have some actions at the national level, but they never admit the C word, like efficiency standards and this kind of a thing. So that was very important. But what was even more important and relevant to this group is that over 2,000 business leaders and financial people came forward and said, well, that was an interesting announcement, but you know what, we're going to stay the course. And that was an enormous signal that those who have to make real decisions, capital deployment and the like, with long wavelength performance being important, recognize we are going to a lower carbon economy. We are having a low carbon energy transition, and when we, the business people, do our planning, that's the context in which we are operating. Now, having said that, that's great, but let's face it, while we are, again, in my view, clearly past the issue of whether or not we have a low carbon energy transition, we are not in reality at the point where we understand the scope, scale, and pace at which that energy transition will take place. And that, of course, is enormously important, again, in business planning cycles, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll come back to that. But I think that's the question that we're here to really discuss. Now, since Paris and the NDCs, it's been pretty clear. Certainly a couple of reports have been very influential, like the IPCC report on the difference between a 1.5 and a 2 degree warmed world, the message from which is you better fight like hell for every damn tenth of a degree, because it makes a real difference. And then certainly in the United States, the U.S. government, which the administration found a little bit inconvenient, but the U.S. government official national assessment on climate change coming out with statements such as we're going to blow way past 2 degrees if we don't take very strong action towards lower carbon. These are examples of what's happened in the scientific evaluation since Paris that have made almost everybody in this business realize that indeed the Paris targets, even the near-term Paris targets in 2030, which were targets on the way to an 80% reduction at mid-century, just aren't going to do the job in the context of these much more aggressive goals. So what we are seeing is many in Europe, in many, again, states, in the United States and cities, including the one we are meeting in today, committing to net zero emissions in the mid-century timescale. Pretty aggressive target, and I'll come back to that. Question is, what do we need to get there? By the way, and I should say actually, in terms of, again, business and net zero, we are also seeing that picked up by businesses in some cases. Again, I'll speak from a personal level. It's no secret in public that I'm on the board of Southern Company. For those of you from other countries may not know, it's a very large utility with a footprint in the Southeast, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. None of those states have a single requirement to go to low carbon, no renewable portfolio standards, et cetera. Southern, and I don't say this defensively, I say this as a fact, is still viewed by many as this old troglodyte utility with coal. the reality is, check the data. In just over a decade, 70% coal to 26% coal, 36% reduction in CO2, corporate commitment to 50% by 2030, which now looks pretty easy to make, commitment to low to no carbon in mid-century, and, I'm happy to say, a board voted CEO incentive package depending on carbon performance. And that's a story that it's not just Southern Company, it's utilities are picking this up really across the country. It goes back to the theme, the electricity sector is driving fast towards low to no carbon. But, as I said earlier, there are the other sectors. And another example of businesses coming together, I was part of a meeting in June, the second meeting, in fact, convened by the Vatican with 11 major oil and gas CEOs and an even larger number of major leaders in the financial community. In the United States, I mean, that means BlackRock, Vanguard, CalSTRS, State Street Bank. We're not talking about small institutions. There were many trillions of dollars represented in that room, and it wasn't the oil companies. And that group signed two statements. Basically, I can explain this unanimously. Quite surprising. It was all voluntary. One statement on the need for carbon pricing, and one statement on the need for corporate carbon transparency. So that's great. That's the example. That's kind of a coalition building that we're going to need a lot more of. Now, of course, the reality is walking that talk. I'd say so far we're maybe crawling that talk. We've got to get to walk and then run the talk. But that's a reflection. I don't think it's less of a commitment. It's a reflection of the reality that those other sectors, transportation, fuels for industry, et cetera, are going to be, in fact, much harder than the electricity sector to address. But this is where, I think we can see in business, not exclusively, obviously, but a very, very large cross-section, really wanting to row the boat in this direction and trying to figure out how to do that within the realities of getting to essentially no carbon in many sectors. Now, the question is, how do you get there? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to say that our group, the Energy Futures Initiative, we have put out a framework that we call the Green Real Deal, which has the characteristics that we think are important to actually get something done. I contrast get something done to preening about what one wants to get done. Pragmatic. It's got to be real solutions that can be implemented in a practical way in a political environment. You need to do that, you need to provide as many options as you can. You need a strong dependence upon innovation. We need coalition building. That Vatican was an example, Vatican statements of one piece of coalition building. You don't do coalition building by engaging in magical thinking, to be perfectly blunt. So we need pragmatic, rooted solutions in the technologies that we have available. We need to have a much more regional focus on solutions because it's not going to look the same everywhere. In another report we did recently, just to give an example of California, obviously the biggest state here in this country, if you just look at the data on renewables, you might be surprised to learn that there are, in 2017, for example, there were as many as 10 days in a row with no wind. 4 hours lithium-ion battery storage is not going to answer that problem. We've got to do other innovation to manage that problem. Finally, I'll just say we certainly need a strong social justice agenda to be kept in mind with this. Just to give you what does that mean, a social justice agenda? I'll give you one example. the relatively well-known, I won't explain it, Baker-Schultz proposal of tax and dividend. Terrific. Because a dividend using all of that funds, we're talking big money, between $200 and $250 billion a year if their plan were implemented. Returning it as a dividend to everybody, equal amount to everybody, is progressive. The lower parts of the income distribution actually will do quite well. If Congress, however, decides to put its fingers on the money and use it for deficit reduction, it couldn't be more regressive. So that just gives a stark example of how a social justice agenda will depend on the policies that are chosen. And I'm just going to end with two brief comments. One is, in terms of the innovation agenda, and there are mixed views, but actually yesterday in New York we came out with another new report on carbon dioxide removal from dilute sources. That's a fancy way of saying the air, maybe some oceans as well, but mainly the atmosphere. And number one, we would say net zero, I emphasize the word net, almost by definition is telling you you can't make it without large-scale negative carbon contributions. That's what we're talking about. To give you a heart attack, the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine in the United States recently, fairly recently, said, you know what? And to get net zero, we're going to need like 10 gigatons of CO2 removal from the atmosphere by mid-century, globally. I'm not advocating this because there are many pathways, including biological sequestration and the like. But just to give you, just to fix the mind, if you were to take that 10 billion tons and do geological disposal, you would have 88 billion barrels of supercritical CO2 per year, 2.5 times the global oil industry. Gives you an idea. This is not for the faint of heart, but we got to move on this agenda very, very aggressively. And success in that agenda of carbon dioxide removal, the more success we have, the more optionality and flexibility there will be for business to meet these very, very aggressive goals. So it's very important. Last comment is we're still in quasi-stealth mode, but not entirely. John Kerry and John, I got to say, John is really the leader on this. We have been working on and will soon be having more officially rolled out something that we call, and some people cringe, World War Zero. Zero means zero carbon. World, it's a global issue. War, it's not we don't want a war. We want to avoid war. We want a mobilization that, and the young people are leading it, that leads to political accountability. The kind of political accountability we saw for the environment on the first Earth Day. That act of saying enough's enough and we want political accountability led to the most intense period of environmental legislation this country has ever seen, and I think that was not unique to this country, spread elsewhere. So that's the kind of thing that we need, that we're working towards. So on the one hand, we're trying to emphasize the tool building, what's the toolkit that we need to get there, but on the other side, until we get to political accountability, those very ambitious goals, the scope, scale, and pace will not be answered in a satisfactory way. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Moniz. So we're going to go to our first panel in a minute, but before we do that, we're going to test our app using prowess. So get out your phones. We're going to ask you our first question. I think it's an easy one, to be honest. How important do you think it is to see increased climate ambition from national governments when they're revising their NDCs ahead of COP26? Have a think. Look deep into your souls on that. And I will introduce the first panel. So we've got a great variety of panelists coming up. They represent different sectors and different geographies around the world. And all of them have set ambitious goals. They've all got science-based targets, and all of them have signed up to our campaigns, RE100, EP100, and EV100. Those are the campaigns that the Climate Group runs with business leaders to accelerate action on renewable energy, on energy productivity, and electric vehicles. We've got now nearly 300 companies who've made that level of ambition and made those commitments, and we're looking to push those numbers from the hundreds up into the thousands. We need to move to this being the new normal and the way of doing business. But we're using those leaders and that combined demand to break down barriers, open new markets, and really accelerate the energy transition. So we're thrilled to work with all of you. So please welcome to the stage our moderator, Vijay Vaidiswaran, the US business editor of The Economist, Pia Heidenmark-Cook, CSO of IKEA Group, Anirban Ghosh, the CSO of Mahindra Group, Camilla Sylvest from Novo Nordisk, the Commercial Strategy and Corporate Affairs, and Barry Parkin, the CSO from Mars. Please join me here, and I will exit.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Vijay Vaidiswaran. I'm the U.S. business editor for The Economist, and formerly our energy and environment editor for many years. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel to talk about ambition and the interplay between business and government. We have seen throughout human history a great race, as it's been called, a race between development and growth and degradation. And at the moment, with climate change, I think we are entering maybe the most intense phase of that race. And in this, business can play a very powerful role as engines of dynamism, of innovation, developing the tools that we heard from Ernie Moniz that we need for both to invent but also to deploy at scale some of the technologies that are going to be needed, but also as possibly bringing to bear pressure on governments, because as we've argued for many years on the pages of The Economist, this is the kind of problem that cannot be solved by markets alone. We need policy, we need global coordination, and I'm very pleased to say, if you'll allow a slight bit of self-promotion, the first ever issue in 176 years devoted to one theme, the current issue of The Economist, we've devoted to climate. So I say this only to recognize the work of our entire team around the world that put many months of research into this, so I commend it to you. But also, again, as part of this effort to raise both awareness but also to mobilize to action on this issue of our time. We have some answers, I think, at this point. We're supposed to look for answers to the poll question. We can see them. Okay, somewhat important. I'd like to know who says it's neither important nor unimportant. Will that person be willing to put their hand up and explain why? No, I didn't think so. Okay, so no big surprise here. Clearly, resounding support for increased ambition. And so I think that's not, again, not a surprise in this room, but also more broadly, I think, that consensus is emerging that this is a serious problem. And in particular, that leading actors from business, both through example, but also by applying pressure, can encourage governments to be more ambitious, more targeted, more expect more, really, in a sense, in terms of what we can achieve. I want to drill into this a little bit with our speakers today. I might start with Pia. At IKEA, you are a company that has a lot of sustainability initiatives predating current concerns or intense concerns about climate. But at the same time, you have a central dilemma, don't you? You're very reliant on resources. You consume more trees than almost anyone on Earth. And so how do you think about this challenge centrally? And what is the role, you think, of the pressure that you want to see from governments versus what you do for your own business reasons or for other attitudes from society, for example, your brand and so on? Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, just to put things in context, we, like Helen said, we signed science-based targets 18 months ago. And last week, we also signed up to the 1.5 pledge. And what it means, and we committed to the IPCC pathway 1 and 2. And what it means is that we need to really look at how we produce, how we supply, how we operate our stores and our factories, but also how we interact with our customers. So we're looking at, if I take the product side, we have committed to only using renewable and recycled materials by 2030. And also to build on what you said, yeah, we do use 1% of all the wood that's being chopped every year. We are putting 36 million hectares, which is the size of Germany, under FSC. So responsible forestry is critical for us.
So standards, transparency,
Standards,
the FSC
absolutely.
certification, as you pointed to, that's one way that you're
Yes.
Adopting a
Yes.
sustainable mantra. How about the actual usage itself? I understand, one of the knocks that can be said, which I'm sure you'll immediately refute, is that, IKEA is inexpensive, disposable furniture. It encourages consumption, excessive consumption, in an age where people are questioning our models. I understand you're actually experimenting with possible reuse and rental models. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, again, going back to the 1.5, a key element for us to reach the 1.5 goal is to become a circular company. And we are discussing internally and actually externally with our CEO to move from mass consumption to mass circularity. And that is massive for us because we are putting a lot of products on the market. What we're testing is how to rent out furniture. And we're testing that in quite a few markets. And that actually means we will maintain ownership of the products and secure that they come back. And by doing that, we potentially cut footprint by 40 to 50% per product, depending on, because we have 10,000 different products from kitchens to sofas to lighting. So it depends on the product. Right. So we absolutely need to go to circularity. And we're already testing and taking back products. And out of curiosity, the biggest product category on eBay, on secondhand market, is IKEA products.
So in a sense, the market's beginning to do this anyway.
Oh, yeah.
But you can do it maybe even with an eye towards design for reuse from the beginning, as with mattresses, which often are very hard to recycle or reuse. But one last word on this from you. Can you make the connection between these virtuous actions you're taking and the role of government, whether it's regulation or mandates or subsidies? What would you like? We're talking about ambition here. How much of this is due to increased ambition from government that you've already seen? How much would you like to see more from government? What would you like to see?
I would say very little of what we do is because of governments telling us to do it. It's coming from our vision, which is the vision we've had for 75 years of creating a better everyday life for the many people. So that is one key part. The culture values of who we are. We believe this is the right thing to do when you want to be for the many people. And secondly, being a resource-intense company and having cost consciousness as one of the core values, because we can't be for the many people if we drive costs through our supply chain. We have to go climate positive and circular, because otherwise we won't be able to meet the customers in the future with the affordable price offer.
Okay, so you see it as a business imperative. Let's switch gears. Let's look at healthcare. Camilla, your company obviously is a leader in areas of healthcare. What is your connection to the central question of this week and what we're discussing? Can you give us an example from insulin or other products where you're known for, where you see an opportunity to improve the sustainability and the climate impact, and what can government help with?
Sure. So, we are a company that produces insulin and GLP-1 for people with diabetes. And 5 years ago, we set out to say we want to make sure that our production runs only on green energy, renewable energy. At the time when we did that, we did not know, exactly how to do it. But we will be able to, as of the first quarter of next year, to make sure that all our facilities on production runs on this all over the world. In the beginning, we actually paid more for the energy. So to Pia's point, sometimes someone needs to take the first step to say this is the right way to go. And then it will generate business for other suppliers, knowing that there is a volume to be sold on green energy, and someone will build their business to do that. So that now means that we are not paying additional for our green energy compared to other types of energy. So that's good, but we're not done yet. So we have a clear ambition to go to zero environmental impact by 2030. And that means that we would have to look at, in addition to production, we would have to look at also operations and transport, because that's actually flights and company cars is is a bigger CO2 footprint than the flights, than the production alone.
Right.
And we have 8,000 company cars. So to the point about what governments can do, it means that if they can help us make sure that there is a facility to be able to charge electrical cars, we would want to switch at the exact point in time where our reps in all countries can do that. So having less taxes and on this would of course be a help. But we cannot wait for that, so we still need to do our own part. The third problem we have is
Just to be clear, the thing that would help is if you had national governments provide or at least remove disincentives for fleet electrification in that example.
So an example is the Danish government.
Or provide infrastructure.
Exactly. So the Danish government has just recently said that they want to reduce CO2 emissions or carbon emissions with 70% by 2030.
How do you feel about that?
We feel quite proud about that. I also think we feel that we don't know exactly how we're going to get there. But it only means that, again, there has to be business in sustainability. So when the government says so, it means that different types of businesses would know that there is a business to be made here. And that means that there will be more volume, and with that more scalability, and with that more business in sustainability. So we think that's quite good. But we have one last problem, and that's our plastic pens. So our insulin comes in plastic pens.
Right. Injectable pens. Right?
Injectable pens, and they take maybe 100 years to degenerate. So you can imagine if they end up in landfills, then if it's 1 billion pens a year, that's not good. So we need to find a way to, so some of the similar problems as Pia just mentioned, to find a way to either take the pens back or to innovate in a way where we can actually, instead of using pens, maybe find a technology, to the points of Ernest, find a technology that means we don't have to inject, but people with diabetes can eat instead. So those are some of the things we eat the medicine instead. That's some of the things we are working on. And just last week we had approval in the US putting a protein into a tablet for the first time ever. We've been working on that for 100 years, I think. So then we need to see innovations to be able to solve this problem. And it's not going to be one solution, so we're working also on take-back programs, because we do believe that, solving the pen issue will take more than just one approach to it.
I want to hold everyone's feet to the fire on the topic, which is government ambition. In that problem you pointed out, all those pens in landfills and so on, what would be useful to you? What is an ambition from either national or municipal governments? Would you like to see recycling mandates, or what's helpful? Give us a concrete example.
Very helpful would be an easier way to get the regulatory process going. So right now there is a different, if we want to take the pens back, there's a different regulatory technical process even in the States of America, but also of course in all other countries. So it's just a big sort of you can say regulatory logistic network to have to set that up.
Coordination and standardization of that would
help. That would be very helpful. And then we probably also need to accept that we need to work with some of our competitors for how we do that, because we cannot have our own boxes standing everywhere, and then competitor have boxes next to that, and then another one. So we need to find a way to collaborate on this. That would be the most effective. So of course we would be looking at how could we do that industry-wise, but maybe even across industries.
Right, or you may need to collaborate with the big pharmacy chains or something like that. Right?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Let's shift gears, pun intended, to Mahindra Group. Anirban, your company has had a record of leadership going beyond your national regulations in India, for example, in energy efficiency. I think you now can make 2 cars with the energy that you used to make 1 car some years ago. And you did that well in advance of any kind of regulatory push. So what camp do you fall into on the business demanding ambition from government? Are you the sort that feels there's a first mover advantage and there's no special additional push you need, or can you identify some areas where it would actually be helpful to have either the national government or some coordinated global effort for your industry? Because you do have particularities in your industry of the energy you consume, but then your customers often consume and pollute much more than you do in the industrial process.
Yes, thank you for the question. You do know that I come from a country called India, which seems to be on steroids right now when it comes to climate change. Far from government asking business to do more, or far from business asking government to do more, every time the Prime Minister comes to the United States, he seems to up his earlier targets before he goes back to the country. I don't know if you heard his 450 gigawatt announcement for renewable energy. We were barely grappling with the 275 gigawatt target that he set maybe a few months ago. So on that area, business and government seem to be taking steps in tandem in many, many spaces. When it comes to things like energy efficiency and automobiles, we believe that there is a very strong business case for this, and that the transition to, say, electric mobility is as much being driven by technology as the needs for electric mobility to solve the climate problem. On energy efficiency, it makes complete business sense. The government has a very good target in the NDC, and we would definitely want to make our contribution towards achieving it. As far as pushing up the targets, I think it's only around the corner, and we know that in 2026 emissions have to be upped. All the right noises are being made. So we're very confident that in India, even before we ask the government to push targets up, they'll be pushing it up on their own.
How about an area where India has done less, that is with buildings, the built infrastructure? Do you see an opportunity there for a role that government can have in that area?
I do, actually. In fact, that's a place which is ripe for regulation. Interestingly, regulation works when there are alternatives. And working with a lot of developers, including our own construction company, we realize that it is no longer more expensive to build green than non-green. And 70% of India's infrastructure as required in 2050 is yet to come up. We also know that between 30 to 40% of emissions come from buildings. So if it doesn't cost more to build green, then everything we build should be green. But it'll take years for all builders to realize this case. So that's an area where I think the government could come in with a nudge, with some sort of a policy or a regulation, which makes everybody build greener than they built before. One path we are thinking is to put green stuff into the building code so that even if people don't realize, they still continue to build green.
I see.
I think that would be a good change.
The spinach inside.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. That's a good way to think about it. Let's turn to Barry. Barry, your company is obviously global in reach, both in where you sell, but also where you source. I think for many years you headed up procurement at your company and have thought a lot about some of the sustainability questions involved. As someone who's had that background of actually getting the business of business, knowing your vendor and your vendor's vendor and supplier to supplier and so on, can you tell us, how do you think about the sustainability question as it affects a global business like yours? And what can you take from that to questions of where we want more ambition?
Yeah, I still lead procurement and sustainability. I mean, I actually think that's pretty powerful. I'll give you a couple of examples. So, yeah, I think we're a food business fundamentally, and food based on agriculture. So we set our first targets on greenhouse gas reduction 10 years ago, and we focused on our operations, and we have 150 factories around the world, and we committed to 100% renewable energy 10 years ago. And we made good progress on that. We're now at more than 50% renewable electricity. I think this is an interesting example. And so we're going around the world doing large-scale renewable energy projects, country by country. And it's a mixed bag, frankly, in terms of the government support. In some, you're still facing headwinds where there are subsidies on fossil fuels. In others, it's neutral. In others, there's a supportive environment. But what we're finding is, irrespective of that, we are able to do large-scale, long-term deals that save us money. So, we have passed that tipping point. And in a way, this is an area where government hardly needs to be involved, I think, on renewable energy. It's happening anyway now. But if you look at our footprint, only 5% of it is around our own operations. Most of it is upstream, embedded in agriculture, right. In the suppliers that supply us and the farming practices themselves. And frankly, the deforestation that still, we all know, is going on around the world. And that's much more challenging. And that's where we need individual governments and individual countries to stand up and transition. And I'd say, in general, they're not that supportive. But there are pockets. So I give you one example. On cocoa, you
head up the World Cocoa Federation.
I'm head of the World Cocoa Foundation.
So you know something about bringing together
actors. We've brought together 80% of the industry, so 33 companies with the two governments in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, that produce 70% of the cocoa. And we've struck a deal, basically. We put together a public-private partnership, the Cocoa and Forests Initiative, which will stop deforestation in those countries. And it's a very clear set of what government needs to do, what industry needs to do. And that's where we have managed to find that sweet spot of shared interest to solve this. It's challenging in other countries. I'm sure we all know what's going on in Brazil. That does not yet exist in Brazil, doesn't yet exist in many other countries. So I think in agriculture, we need to see governments and industry coming together. And not just on initiatives like this, but think about where are governments putting their funding in agriculture. The vast majority of it is prolonging the existing unsustainable agricultural model. And we need to see a shift from prolonging that model to shifting to sustainable agricultural models. And we all know that's a big part of it. 30% of the climate challenge we've got is related to agriculture. So it's a big deal.
You're committed to the science-based targets. You're a leader, obviously a world leader in your field. Your company is as market leader. Is there is one of the reasons that a number of governments are not acting as you might wish that there are lots of other companies that are not as big, whose brand is not as well known, who may be more immune to pressure, let's say from consumer boycotts and such? That is there a bit of a collective action problem on the business side? And perhaps as an early mover, you might even suffer a first mover disadvantage. Is there something you could tell us about this from the front lines that would help overcome this problem, since you say you're having some difficulties with governments in some areas?
Yeah, and I think this is a good example. We signed up to science-based targets years ago, and there's now 300 companies on RE100, for example, but only 300 companies. And how many companies are there in the world? Millions.
Sure.
So that's the challenge. How do we get more companies moving? What we've just announced.
I think Helen's on the job, right?
Yeah. What we've just announced this week is our pledge for the planet, and the interesting part of that, obviously, we committed to 1.5 degrees, but the interesting part is we've asked our 2,000 biggest suppliers to get on board with what we are doing. And we've asked them to join RE100, and we've asked them to set science-based targets. So now, they're not all 2,000 going to switch tomorrow, but we'll use the commercial relationships we've got, and we will influence them over time. And I think we need to move the next 1,000, the next 10,000, the next 100,000 companies. Because if you think about it, if all companies moved on this, then you wouldn't need government. If all governments moved on this, you wouldn't need companies. Now, it's going to be a combination of the two. So we have a duty both to get companies moving, but also to get government moving.
Mm-hmm. I wondered if anybody else on the panel could pick up on the point about supply chains. As leading companies, you have global supply chains. You have some powers of persuasion over your suppliers. But at The Economist, we've spent a bunch of time looking at global supply chains. I wrote a long special report on global supply chains a couple of months ago. In the very recent issue, we dig into the question of climate risk in supply chains and conclude that, broadly speaking, most companies are not taking account of climate risk when they think about their supply chains, even in the most immediate sense of having, let's say, factories in low-lying areas. They're not accounting for that. The insurers are not yet pricing risk in the short term. But the longer term, there's questions about, will this really be affected by regulation? There's some uncertainty, maybe quarterly reporting cycles rather than long-term thinking. So there's some questions raised in our reporting on this. What is your experience when you deal with your supply chains, which have such a big impact? Anything positive to report, or any lesson we can learn from what you've been able to achieve?
Yeah, so I can say that it is a clear part of our environmental strategy to focus on our suppliers. And we've looked at, of course, at our footprint and where a big part of that comes from, and that is from the suppliers. So we are working exactly the way that was described with our key suppliers first, those that makes the biggest footprint, and trying to engage them into also having zero environmental footprint. And they're actually picking up on this in a very positive way. So it's not necessarily...
Don't they complain about the costs?
No, it's not in a forced way, but of course we are also a big, buyer from them. So there is an incentive to do that. So I think it doesn't have to be forced, but there is also a lot of information to be shared on how to do it the best way, the most effective way. So I think it's a bit of a train-the-trainer concept that can be applied in this context.
And I can just build on from IKEA, of course, as we have set a 1.5 for scope 1, 2, and 3. And the biggest chunk of our impact also sits in the supply chain and connected to the materials. We do see the risks, both in terms of where the factories are located, but also where we have our materials. So absolutely, it's a critical part of moving towards 1.5.
Actually, anyone who's signed on to SBTs must work with supply chains. We do find a lot of opportunity in the overlap between planet and profit. So there are things which suppliers take on very easily.
What's an example of an easy way?
So 300 out of our 400 suppliers went 100% LED over the last 2-3 years. That's a very easy win. We're trying out a whole bunch of energy efficient motors in our factory right now. Once the testing is done and if we find we're saving the 30% of energy that it's projected to save, that I think will turn out to be an easy win again. Broadly, I do think energy efficiency is an easy win because all investment pays back for itself fairly quickly, 18 to 24 months. We've got returns of investment in excess of 24%. You can't laugh at that, and you shouldn't throw that money away. The only thing that smaller suppliers might say is we don't have the capital to invest in it, but then there are many ways of getting that capital today, especially because you get returns on it.
So before he left us, Secretary Moniz gave us the anecdote about big oil companies being convened by Pope Francis to commit to a couple of things. And one of those things was they pledged their support for carbon pricing and to promote that or push for that in their relevant national legislatures and so on. Let me ask each of you, what is your perspective on carbon pricing as a tool, from government, and how would you like to see it implemented or furthered? Maybe we can start with you, Barry.
Yeah, I think we've reached the point where it's absolutely clear it's essential. So we're for it, and we will be advocating more and more strongly for that going forward. It's critical. This transition is not happening fast enough. Companies are not broad scale adopting practices fast enough, and it's an absolute scattergun approach on carbon pricing. There's lots of smaller initiatives and subnational initiatives, but it needs to happen at scale across the world, and that will drive a dramatic acceleration. So I think it's absolutely essential.
Have you gamed out what it would mean for your economics inside your business?
Yeah, I think it's very straightforward. We have a carbon footprint of 33 million tons. It's about the same as Panama. Pick a number. Let's say it's $10 a ton. It's probably too low, but that's $330 million cost to us. So every time we reduce our carbon footprint, we're taking that risk off the table. So deforestation is 13 million tons. The day I can prove that we are not driving deforestation, I take another $130 million of risk off the table. Our CFO is here in the crowd. Music to his ears, I'm sure.
He's smiling. I think he's taking notes. Even better.
Yeah.
Even better. Yeah, what do you say? Carbon pricing.
Yeah, for us, I see carbon pricing as one of many tools. Fully for when set up in a smart, good way. But I think we also need to, there's not one silver bullet. So if we have carbon pricing, everything will be sorted. So I think it's also, we should look at fossil fuel subsidies. Are we paying the right price for energy? Being in 30 countries, we see quite a lot of differences in just what you pay for your energy.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of tools that we need to explore, but absolutely, when done right, carbon pricing has its role.
So phasing out perverse subsidies, that looks at the same question of externalities with a different lens, doesn't it? But broadly speaking, it sounds like you're supportive. Let's see what Camilla says.
No, I agree to that. I think...
Would it have much of an impact on your business, do you think?
It would have an impact on our business, but of course we are looking at reducing our carbon footprint to a very large extent already. But what I like to say is that that we create business in sustainability. And of course, carbon pricing is one tool to do that. But there are also other tools like the government putting forward the targets we talked about before. So it creates more certainty for those who want to produce in an environmentally friendly way. Right? So I think this is just, as Pia says, this is just one of the tools. And it's important to keep going at creating business in sustainability like that. You know?
Right. So you'd like to see a mix of tools.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we talked about coordination on the recycling front. You mentioned targets for fleets and so on, infrastructure.
Yeah. So that it just makes business sense to be producing that way.
Sure. Anirban, what do you think about carbon pricing?
Let me separate this conversation into two.
Okay.
Internal carbon pricing for companies and carbon pricing by governments.
Right.
Internal carbon pricing by companies is a no-brainer. You don't pay any money to anybody. You just use that carbon price to move towards a low carbon pathway, and you save loads of money. Over the last 3 years, using an internal carbon price, we've cut carbon footprint by 25%.
Can you tell us what that price is?
$10 per ton.
Okay.
You don't really need a very high carbon price internally to make this shift, and we can get into the economics of that later. I've only got 2 minutes. On the government side of the story, using a carbon price to move towards a low carbon trajectory of development is very useful. As long as the carbon price levied is used for that, it's good. If it goes into the general exchequer and for general development, I don't think you can call it a carbon price. But the need to move to a low carbon trajectory is important, and perhaps the only way to do it in an efficient manner is a carbon price. There was a report released on Saturday which goes into all of this in great detail.
Right. So broadly speaking, support for carbon pricing, but a more nuanced answer as you'd expect. In just a little time remaining, I just want one quick answer, because we were challenged at the beginning of this session to say, after all the blah, 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 after the talk is done this week, what will you act on back home? So I'm going to give you each a chance very quickly to say, what's an action you're going to take back at your companies? Please, we'll start with you, Barry.
I am going to crank up the pressure on our suppliers.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would say keep setting goals that are not 2030 or 2040, but setting milestones here and now so that we move now and not tomorrow.
Sooner, more tangible.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Camilla?
Yeah, going to zero CO2 emissions from operations and transport, and then finding a solution to the plastic problem I mentioned earlier.
Right. Okay, we're going to watch out for that one.
Yeah.
Anirban, last word to you.
Deliver on the commitments. Commitments on neutrality, commitments on SBTs, commitments on energy efficiency, renewable energy, managing waste, water. They're all in place, so they need to be delivered on now.
Okay, you're going to walk the talk.
Pretty much.
Okay, I think that's an inspiring note to end on. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers. They were fantastic. And let me welcome Helen back to the stage.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. It was great to hear all of that. Now, I mentioned at the top that we're very excited that the COP next year will be coming to the UK, and to sort of get us knowing what the road to that looks like, we've got Archie Young, who is the head of International Climate Negotiations, EU and Carbon Markets at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy from the UK. So tell us all about it.
Thank you very much, Helen. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I should start by passing on the apologies of Claire Perry, who many of you will know and many of you will know has been nominated as the prospective president for COP26. She's very sorry not to be here today. As you can imagine, quite a few people had to jump on a plane yesterday. So I'll start, actually, you opened the session by talking about explaining NDCs, the UNFCCC, and you said, those of you who know that, you can go to your happy place. That is my happy place. So I've been the UK's lead negotiator in the climate talks the last few years, and that is, it's comfortable because it's a process and we know what we're doing sometimes, but also it often feels disconnected from reality. And if I had a penny for every time somebody talks about the NDCs and the real world, it's incredible, because actually what that's saying is that what governments have committed to do is separate and distinct from what actually all the economic actors in this room and in the real world outside in the street are doing. And that is simply not reality. It's also, I think, quite unhelpful in terms of driving the action that we want to see. I know that probably in this room we have more climate experts than most other places, but I reflect on the panel that we've just heard, and I wish actually that you weren't here, many of you. I'm sorry. Because I suspect most of you are the converted. Most of you actually probably already have set science-based targets, or you are members of EV100, RE100, EP100. I actually wish that many of your places were taken by either the big incumbents who are holding back some of the progress that we're trying to make, or the people from the room that I just left actually to come here. So I was in a room with about 20 other lead negotiators. And I wish that actually we could all hear the real testimonies of companies who are committing to alignment with Paris, committing to 1.5, who are being honest about, yes, we've had to change the way we do things. Yes, there have been some upfront costs, but are also absolutely clear about the benefit, the economic, the social, the moral, the employment benefit as well that they're getting from taking those steps. And I think the more we can use events like this and the speakers that we had to get out of climate group meetings and into every single boardroom, the more powerful that will be. Helen, you asked if I could give a bit of context about COP26, but I think it's helpful if I start with a bit of context, which I'm sure many of you will know, but in terms of kind of why this is an important moment in terms of the international climate process. So we have, the science is undeniable. It is clear. The IPCC Special Report on 1.5 makes really quite real the frightening potential impacts of a warming world to both 1.5 and especially a 2-degree world. We have already warmed by around 1 degree, and current international commitments take us to, depending on the methodology used, somewhere around 3 degrees. So we need countries and businesses to shift to get back on track. Paris Agreement has in it a ratchet mechanism because those commitments that were made by governments were largely made in 2014, 2015. When they added them up, they knew that that wasn't enough. So in the Paris Agreement, there is a commitment that every 5 years, countries will come back and they will come forward with new enhanced contributions. We are at that moment now whereby the expectation is that countries will come forward next year with new commitments. And so the Secretary-General Summit on Monday was designed to be a moment to generate the political momentum, but also to demonstrate to countries who might be uncertain that actually the technology, the finance, and the will is there from the global community to push things forward. I wish that I had had a chance to put one of those VVox questions up earlier, because I would love to get a sense from this room as to what messages you took away from the Climate Action Summit. I've seen various media reports, but if I reel off just a few, some of the numbers that I took away from it. So what we heard were 77 countries, 10 regions, and 100 cities committing to go net zero by 2050. We heard 70 countries signal an intention to enhance their NDC. We heard 9 countries increase their contribution to the Green Climate Fund, such that replenishment is now 7.3 billion. And I'm very pleased that the UK, we doubled our contribution to the Green Climate Fund. And we heard, I think, in terms of business announcements, we heard 50 financial institutions subject their $2.9 trillion of assets to climate impact testing. And we as the UK, we were also very proud that we were able to announce that we would be doubling our international climate finance as a whole to £11.6 billion over 5 years. And we led with Egypt and some other countries a call for action on adaptation and resilience. But I don't know. I mean, that for me is a real kind of sign of optimism that all these countries are signaling their intention. You've got businesses saying the same. And yet there is something in the air which says, we're not seeing this. This doesn't feel real yet. And we're still hearing from countries a nervousness and a reticence to go back to their capitals and really engage in those difficult conversations about how can they raise their nationally determined contributions. It was very helpful to hear from Indian colleague here about the potential for increasing the Indian NDC. And indeed, many of the sub-targets are being increased. But we are looking forward to seeing the overall NDC being enhanced as well. Why do I say all that to you? Because I think that actually those countries, all countries, need to hear the voice of business, of civil society, of their citizens that call not just for more action, but are very specific about the action they want and about how they can do that. And so, I mean, in the UK, we have been able to reduce our emissions by 42%. We've grown our economy by 72%. You can take action on climate and grow your economy. And I want that voice to be heard saying that this is economic, this is good business, and this is the right way forward. So my ask to you all in this room is set, if you haven't already, set a science-based target aligned with 1.5 degrees. Join one of these fantastic coalitions that the Climate Group and other organizations run. Bring it to the boardroom. Have the conversations that need to be taken. But don't just bring it to your boardroom. Bring it to the boardroom of all of your counterparts, all of your colleagues. Convince them that this is the way forward. Take action and tell the story. Tell your consumers what you are doing, but also tell that story down your supply chains so that the governments in the countries where you are operating also feel that confidence and that commitment. We in the UK are committed. We're committed to working with you, and I look forward to a successful COP26 when we'll see the world take that step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Archie. So our next two panels are going to be about renewable energy and electric vehicles. Energy generation and transport together account for over 50% of the world's energy-related emissions. And each area requires significant investment, so solar panels, wind turbines, charging infrastructure. We've got all of that to do. And with clear direction and supporting regulatory frameworks, we can really unlock and speed up action. And that's what we want to talk about in these panels. So the first of those is going to be about renewable energy, as it says on the screens. We've talked a lot about the Climate Group's RE100 initiative, which we run in partnership with CDP, which is a commitment to 100% renewable electricity. And we've got more than 200 members operating in over 140 markets. Between them, they create 219 terawatt-hours of clean electricity demand, which, if that number's a bit strange, is the equivalent nearly as much as you need to power Indonesia. And committed companies are going to help displace the equivalent of 27 US coal plants. So that gives you a sense that's significant. And they're transforming electricity grids globally. But we know that their biggest barrier to reaching their targets is unsupportive regulatory frameworks. And strengthening the business case is really going to help create new opportunities for companies. And that's what we'd like to talk about. Now, before we do that, before I introduce the next panel, we're going to ask you your second question with the app. I think this one's a little harder than the first one. So is your company sourcing a sizable part of its electricity from renewable sources? And those are your choices. Yes, for different reasons. No, for different reasons. Or I just don't know. So let us know your answer to that. And meanwhile, I'd like to introduce Heather Clancy, who's the editorial director at GreenBiz, Gayle Schueller from 3M, Rudy Winter from the National Grid, Angie Schueller from Anheuser-Busch, and Dany Qian from Jinko Solar. Thank you. Thank you.
So the gentleman from The Economist mentioned they just dedicated an entire issue to this coverage of this, and I'm so thankful and grateful to those in the mainstream media that are doing this. GreenBiz, for those of you who don't know us, is all corporate climate action all the time. So that's our entire focus. So our entire site all the time is dedicated to this issue. And I'm very, very honored to be here. I've been covering the renewable energy, electricity specifically, interest for some time. It stems back to actually the RE100 has done a great job of inspiring action. I also feel like there was a sort of turning point. It was in 2015 when this thing called the Corporate Buyers Principles was released. And what it did, and Mars was part of that, I know they're in here, I can't remember if anyone else on this panel was, but it said, we want to buy renewable energy, we want it to be simpler, we want it now. And there's been a voracious appetite. Just last week, Google procured 1.6 gigawatts in one fell swoop. 18 projects takes it up to about 5.5 gigawatts. And that's just an enormous amount. That, by the way, its one deal was almost the entirety of the whole corporate procurement last year. So, but tremendous appetite. I'm so grateful. We have two buyers here on this panel, so two people who are procuring. We obviously have someone representing utilities perspective, and we have a supplier, who talked to us about this. We have our results. I can stop stalling. So yes, yes. The most of you said yes. It just makes business sense. Second answer, I don't know. Yes, you can see it. Just yes to reduce carbon footprint and address stakeholder expectations. And I do appreciate that no, it's too difficult. That's what, 16 or 13, 14%. You've got to make those numbers bigger for people with eyes like mine. So I'd like to start with Gayle, because you're actually a relatively new member of the RE100, and you kind of joined and said, and we hit this already, all in one fell swoop. So just tell us a little bit about why you felt it was necessary to join, and you know what it means for your business. Why is it important as part of your strategic plan at 3M?
So 3M fundamentally is a science-based company. We're technological, we're techie, we love things like renewable energy. We've been in the renewable energy business in terms of supplying films that help solar panels last longer, in terms of reflective materials that help solar panels be more efficient. We've been providing films that help wind turbines last longer. So we've been in this business, supplying into this business for a long time. For the first time in 2015, we put forward a goal around having 25% of our global electricity come from renewable sources. And that seemed really scary and really daunting at the time. But then we surpassed it in 2018. So at that point, we had to start thinking bigger. It seemed like such a big deal to get to that 25%, but yet we were there. So we started looking at what it would take and what we could do and how we would advance things. And at the end of first quarter this year, in March of this year, we announced that in 2025, instead of going to 25%, we would go to 50% by 2025. And that we would join the RE100 and go to 100% by 2050. We don't really know how exactly we're going to do that, but we have a lot of good ideas on the way. And then we actually flipped the switch that day to turn our headquarters, which has a significant electrical footprint, to 100% renewable electricity the following day. So it was a big deal for us. I will tell you that there are members of my colleagues that are kind of nervous about it still, but there are others that it's really inspiring, whether it's our own employees, it's potential employees, it's people around the communities where we work. It feels good. People feel really good about it. So it was something that made sense for us in many different directions.
So, Angie, your organization, Anheuser-Busch, has been in it a longer, I think a couple years at least.
2017.
Awesome, thank you for the clarification.
March 28th.
She actually, nice. This year, you took out some Super Bowl ads talking about this. Why was that important for you to communicate that?
Yeah, just to step back, so we did make our commitment at the beginning of 2017 to 100% renewable electricity and joined RE100. Later that year, we announced a partnership with Enel Green Power in the U.S. to construct a very large off-site wind farm in the state of Oklahoma. We then followed, our company came out with ambitious 2025 goals in 2018, which included renewable electricity, but also carbon reduction, a 25% carbon reduction goal in our supply chain. So it was at that point where we actually unleashed all of our 2025 goals and wanted to move forward. Now, one connection, strong connection for us as a business is we brew great beer, right? And so there's a strong connection to sustainability in beer in terms of how beer is produced, the way we use our resources to produce great quality beer. Our Budweiser brand, our flagship global brand, took on our renewable electricity goal in a new way. So for us, we think about it as a purpose-driven brand. And when you look at what you buy today and what consumers demand today, I think they are very educated. They know and understand, and they want to know more about where their products are produced and what companies are doing to make sure that they're producing them in a responsible way. So it's awesome to see our Budweiser brand step up and really carry that flag for our company. And we decided to unleash that on the Super Bowl stage. So I'm just curious, show of hands, who saw the Super Bowl commercial? Great, that's awesome. So, I mean, it was a spotlight for us, and it brought a lot of attention for us to the brand, and it's a way that we connect with our consumers. In the end, our consumer needs to know what we're doing and why we're doing it, right? So it's that connection for us.
Great. So, Rudy, National Grid, multinational gas and utility company, you've committed to reducing your greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. So I'm curious, when you were thinking about that strategy, what really mattered most? What was the key driver? So you got customer demand, like people here on the panel, policy, right? Were you complied to do this, or is it you want to lead the way? You want to this is a corporate advantage for your organization.
Sure. So we put together something called the 80 by 50 pathway, and to answer your question, it was a little bit of both. One is our customers demanded it. Second, the states in which we operated in the U.S. are New York and New England, very policy-driven states, and they all had 80 by 50 targets at the time, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050 off of 1990 levels. So we took that as an internal goal for ourselves, but then we also said, we're a network company, right? We're connecting generators and supply sources with customers who use power. So we said, what's our role in helping the states hit those goals, hit those targets? So we put pen to paper and we started saying, okay, well, what's it going to take to get there? You know, what are the levers you've got to pull, and what's it going to look like? Because people are talking about targets, but no one's actually saying what it's going to take to get there. So we spent about a year doing that. And interesting how things change in this sort of topic in this sector. Because, you know, once we did all this work and we want to talk about our 80 by 50 pathway, it's now, you know, this year. I almost sound like a climate denier talking about 80 by 50, right? So it's changed a lot. But the bottom line is, you know, the same three levers have to be pulled. And if you heard Secretary Moniz before, he talked a little bit about it. One was the electric sector, right? The electric generation sector. And that has to essentially be carbon-free. Got it. But to get to below 1990 levels, the two big sectors you've got to really change is transportation and heat. Those are the two big ones that haven't moved that much since 1990, quite frankly. So we put pen to paper. We didn't say we had all the answers because we didn't. And the big aha to us was, A, what's it going to take in those different sectors? B, you can almost see a pathway to get to 2030. Getting between 2030 and 2050, it's really hard to see. So you have to make some assumptions about technology, about adoption rates, things like that. And we're essentially using it as a piece of work where we can convene discussions, because no one has the answers. Our regulators don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. Suppliers don't have all the answers. But we're trying to convene discussions to say, what can we do collectively to get there? And do we realize for EVs, for example, that's going to mean 10 million EVs on the roads in the northeastern states if you want to hit this target. So we're just trying to really bring some reality to the target and say, okay, what do we have to do to get there?
So Dany, your company joined the RE100 this week, I think. So thank you. You're only the fourth Chinese company to join, and you're the largest solar PV manufacturer in the world. I'm not sure people necessarily know that in this room. You know, why are you committed to this particular initiative? why do you see this sort of corporate interest as being important for what your company does, this corporate sourcing and procurement interest?
As a world leading solar company, I think it's a shame and doesn't make sense that we produce the renewables and we don't use it. So it's our responsibility to drop down the solar cost and making it economic sensible to everyone. And also it's our commitment to deploy and adopt more on-site and off-site renewable source, promise to be empowered 100% by renewable someday soon in the future. So thanks to technical advance, renewable energy, particularly solar power cost, has dropped dramatically in the past 3 to 5 years. And in 2016, we quoted 2.42 cents for a 1.2 gigawatt solar project in Abu Dhabi. After that, we quoted even lower, pretty much close to 2 cents per kilowatt hour now. So it's much lower than the local the power price. What does that mean to the private sectors? It's exactly the right time for private sectors to deploy the renewables at a larger scale. I think too early could be too costly. Later will be really too late. Today, moving to the renewables is not only a matter of CSR, it's a matter of saving electricity bills significantly. It's a matter of reducing your production costs. It's a matter of a good and solid business with acceptable ROI. So for giant companies and industry leader companies like the RE 100 members, it's our new meaning to set an example of doing well by doing good.
Thank you. Angie, I'm going to go back to you. Now, you mentioned where you've been so far, and you've had some real success recently, especially in the U.S. And actually, one of the things I really appreciate is that you're announcing projects that add to the grid, right? They're adding new solar. I mean, there's projects that are buying chunks of capacity in markets where there's already a lot of wind, but there's places where you can make a difference in saying, I'm going to support this project, and we're going into a market where there isn't necessarily a lot of renewable to begin with. So I'm just curious if you could just briefly touch on some of your progress and why that sort of additionality, if you will. I know that's a term, it's got vague meaning, but why that focus?
Yeah,
adding?
Thank you. That's a very critical, important point of our goal. Is from day one we said we were going to build. So we're going to build new infrastructure. We're going to create additionality in some markets around the world. We're going to create new markets, new infrastructure completely. And for the U.S., we have made progress. It's a rather mature market, as you probably know, but we've been able to sign now, actually start one large-scale deal, which we referenced, which was the enabler for Budweiser, which is a wind farm in the state of Oklahoma. It's 152 megawatts, so it's a large off-site wind deal that's about half of all of our needs for the entire U.S. And then just this year, in June, on World Environment Day, we announced that we've contracted with Recurrent Energy for a large-scale solar farm, also utility off-site in the state of Texas. It'll start up in 2021, and it will essentially give us the remaining 50% of our entire portfolio of needs in the U.S. So a lot of success here, but in terms of we are also in one of the more mature markets. Globally, we are around 16% right now of our total needs up and running, and that's about 6 terawatt hours. So to put it back to Helen's stat on terawatt hours of total RE members, we're about 6 terawatt hours globally, and we've already hit that 16% mark.
So I just want one quick follow-up, and then I'm actually going to hit you on some global issues in a moment. But why just 60%? What makes it? What's in the other markets that isn't enabling you to move as fast? Have you just not focused on it yet, or are there factors that people should be considering?
A lot of it's time related as well. So we started very specifically in Mexico. Actually, we signed our first deal in Mexico that just came online. This deal, again, a large scale deal with Iberdrola. We moved to the U.S. quite frankly because we could see the solutions were there. I think it's just taking more time in other countries as we pace our roles and responsibilities as well, and try to leverage everything that we can to make sure that we get the right solution at the right time to hit that 2025 mark.
Yeah. So Gayle, you started at home, really, and but I know you're thinking globally because you are global, your company. So where next? What's going on with your global ambitions?
Yeah, so 3M has operations in 70 different countries around the world. And the majority of our sales are actually outside the United States and distributed across multiple continents. So we have a combination of on-site solar, power purchase agreements, and agreements with utilities. And we actually have on-site renewables on 3 different continents today. So we are spreading things out. The models for utility agreements and for PPAs are varying considerably in different countries around the world. We have our largest footprint of the new renewable footprint that we've added is in the United States. And then what we're doing actually to look all around the world is we look where our largest usage is. Okay, so we Pareto out where our biggest electricity using facilities are, and we map those as our highest priorities. And for markets like in the United States, we can really plan out pretty well how we're going to address those and where we go. In countries like Costa Rica or Panama, the whole grid is pretty much renewable today. So that's really exciting, and we don't have to do a lot of extra lifting to make those kinds of things happen. But then there's whole parts of Asia in particular where we have significant footprints, but there isn't the infrastructure or the model today to do it. So that's when it really becomes important that we do things with partnerships. I mentioned that we are partnering with utility providers. We want to do more of that in Asia. We're looking at scenarios where we partner with other companies that are either customers or suppliers, and that together we can negotiate for a bigger, more productive deal for us. And I think that works well for the utilities as well when we do things like that.
Yeah, so actually a quick question for Rudy sort of on that issue of partnership, because I think that's important for, how does National Grid work with the corporates in its region? Like what's it doing?
So great question. A lot of the corporates within our region were either facilitating renewable contracts with them and suppliers, or working with them on energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is the first thing we start talking to the corporate clients about. There's still a lot more that can be done there, and we're working with all the corporate accounts on energy efficiency, and then talking about renewables. When we tend to think about our work with renewables, we're buying it for not necessarily one corporate client, but we're buying it for cities, towns, parts of a state. So we're making very large purchases when we do procure our renewables.
And you referenced earlier your focus on energy, heat, thermal processes, right? And also EVs.
Yeah.
Transportation, essentially. So why are those things harder? Because I know they're harder.
Yeah.
They're considerably harder. But where are you in the curve on that, right?
Sure.
And what are the things you need to see happen in order for us to push further along? Because E is energy,
right?
Not just electricity.
Yeah. So good question. So it's all hard when you think about the sectors. The electricity generation sector since 1990 has reduced a lot of CO2 and a lot of carbon, but it did it largely through converting to natural gas. So even before renewables were there. It's the transportation sector hasn't moved much since 1990, and the heating sector hasn't moved much since 1990. So it's all relative around what's really moved. So sticking with the electric sector first, like I said, it's moved originally because of the natural gas that was used here in the United States. It's continuing to move because of renewables, right? So we've signed up, we've interconnected about 2.7 gigawatts of renewables onto our network in the US. We're going to probably interconnect about another 1.5 gigawatts by the end of 2020. We recently signed up for 400 megawatts of offshore wind in Massachusetts, another 400 megawatts of offshore wind in Rhode Island. In our states in New England, Massachusetts has, I think it's second only to New Jersey, for the most, maybe you drove the New Jersey numbers.
I live in New Jersey.
It's second only to New Jersey in terms of connected solar per square mile, right?
And lots of offshore wind.
And lots of offshore wind. So you can see the renewables piece on the electric sector driving that to almost carbon-free. Got it. Your question was, why is the EVs and the heating sector? It's just they haven't moved as much since 1990. So if you think about the EVs, what we're going to need to hit those targets are some things in orders of tens of millions of EVs on the roads in northeastern states by 2030. 2030 is not that far off. You're going to need infrastructure, like charging infrastructure, to support those EV sales. When you think about heating in the northeastern United States, still use a lot of fuel oil to heat. You don't see that anywhere else around the country. So you have about 30–40% of fuel oil being used to heat homes and businesses throughout the Northeast. So first step is, how do you convert that to a cleaner fuel, whether it's natural gas or to electricity going down the road. So that's what I meant by it's going to be harder, because those are starting from a place, I think, that doesn't have the momentum yet that renewable energy has.
Fair enough. So Dany, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what we can expect as far as technologies that will help push this along, right? So there's so much potential in solar. There's so much potential for better efficiency. There's amazing applications. What are you focused on to help sort of get us beyond this where we are now to the next phase?
I think when we solve the first problem of renewable of solar, that's cost, then comes to the second problem, intermittent energy. So how to make renewables a perfect energy without outstanding weakness? That's the work we need to do further. So I think we need some new or technical innovations, such as low-cost, larger capacity energy storage. For example, the pumped hydro utility scale storage to cheaply store the energy that we generate at massive scale. Like big stationary battery packs that can be integrated with on-site renewable generations. You know that the big stationary battery pack, they has an advantage of agility along with fast construction and less requirements regarding to the locations. Although some innovative technology like stored energy in stacked concrete blocks. So it's realistic now. And also we need like the solar hydrogen production, clean for clean. High efficient solar building materials like solar tiles, solar walls, solar facade, solar roof, to fully utilize the surface of building to promote the net zero carbon technologies. And also some like the solar desalination to turn desert into greenland. And very important is solar EV charging. You know, that's, it doesn't make sense that we shift from the oil-driven vehicle to coal-fired electricity-driven vehicle. It's still fossil fuel. It's still great. So we should turn EV to CEV, turn to electricity vehicle to clean electricity vehicles. So actually, there's lots of things needs to do, and we need a global collaboration. We have to synergize the efforts and the resource of best researchers, national labs, entrepreneurs, venture capitals from all across the world, with unprecedented focus on breakthrough technology to make the renewables a perfect energy.
Thank you. Wow. So a lot of those are not in one place. They're decentralized, right? So they're here, they're there, they're at their house, they're at a company, they're down the street. So do you, Rudy, as someone that's got to manage all this, what is the role of grid in enabling that? Yeah. So what role does your company play in getting some of those things off the ground?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So those things, the grid doesn't go away with the proliferation of EVs and renewables. If anything, you're going to see electricity load growth increase because we're adding EVs and things like that to the market. You have to keep in mind, most of the grids in the U.S. were designed and built for a very different operation. Central station power plants distributing or sending out power across to end users. We're asking the grid to operate the ways it was not designed to operate, right? We're also asking grids that were built and designed 60, 70, 80 years ago to operate differently. I was speaking with a colleague recently, and he said, you know, if Thomas Edison came alive today and walked into a substation, he'd recognize every single component, right? Because it hasn't changed that much. So with that in mind, we've got to invest a huge amount of time, energy, effort, and brain power and dollars into modernizing the networks, modernizing the grid. One of the things we're doing in the U.S. is we're looking to digitize all of our substations on our transmission network. By digitizing that, that allows us to operate it remotely, allows us to move power flows remotely, because power flows will change as we're getting power from different sources, people's homes, maybe their cars, offshore. Very different than the grid was designed to get power from a power plant that maybe isn't there anymore. So if power flows are changing, we've got to invest in the grid, modernize the grid, number one. Number two, we're also thinking a little bit differently about what's our role in doing that. Traditionally, our role was essentially building pipes or wires or cables to make that happen. With new technologies like battery energy storage, we're saying, well, maybe I don't need to build a new cable. Instead, I could put a battery there for maybe a third of the price. And that makes sense for our customers. Doing that on the island of Nantucket now. The island's fed by 2 cables that link it to mainland Massachusetts. In case of one cable going out, we have another cable as a backup. Load growth has grown on the island. Projected we'll probably have to put another cable there, as well as put some diesel around the island. Instead of doing that, we have said built a large battery energy storage project there. I'm doing the ribbon cutting there next week. That eliminates us building another cable to that island, right, for maybe a third of the cost. And it eliminates needing to put diesel peakers around the island as well. So new technology, investing in the grid, because we need the grid to integrate all of these components.
One of the things that I heard, Dany, you really talking about was a lot of new applications, right? And that means people that have to put those applications in place. So training, jobs, and putting people to work doing very different things than in the past. So what role do you think that, that the private sector and governments should be playing, maybe together or separately, to help with this sort of support this infrastructure ideas and also the training that we need to get these new things off the ground?
I think that this fundamentally is that the government set the rules of the game, which the companies can play with and actively engage into. So at a time when grid parity becomes a universal norm, what the government needs to do is just to fix the incentive structure to make sure that the companies are incented towards sustainable versus unsustainable technologies. For example, establish some kind of carbon tax or potential cap on trade on carbon. And for the private sectors, I think there should be more responsive to this trend. And to understand, if you don't take action now, you will suffer soon if the carbon tax is high enough. So, you know, today moving to sustainable is no longer a fiscal burden, no longer a disruption to the economy. Instead, it's a new driving force for the economy. And even create some so-called climate economy, attracting billions of dollars investment and creating millions of jobs. So it's really happened in China and in US and in Latin America, in everywhere. So I think if we have the policy aligned, we have the business benefited, there will be a forcing function to accelerate this transition.
So I'd like to actually hear from the rest of you on this issue, just the role that that local, subnationals, and national governments are playing in helping, or policies, I should say, are in helping shape your plans and strategy, and what things maybe you're doing collaboratively to make this work in a different way. So I'm going to go to you first, Angie.
Yeah, I mean, so we are a very global company, but we also act very locally in all these different regions. Everywhere we operate, 50 different countries around the world. So it's not a one size, I think, fits all answer. But certainly in the U.S., we did have the ability to act with the production tax credit and the investment tax credit for both solar and wind. We don't see that same sort of subsidy everywhere, but certainly there are different things that are coming along in different countries just at a different rate, right? So as much as we can, we know and understand that we're not going to be able to get there on our own. We knew and understood going into this that a lot of these countries would be very challenging. Indeed. So when we set the goal, this big ambitious goal, we had no idea how we were going to get there in certain countries.
I want to just one little quick follow-up then on that. Though. What did you do in those countries? So the ones where you didn't have as much to work with, essentially, how did you go in and figure out how they could put in place? But did you go out and inspire the people there locally to work with you?
Yeah, it's engaging stakeholders. It's trying to engage governments where we can. It's to work with industry association groups, NGOs, partners in the industry, suppliers where we can. So it's all of those things, I think, rolled into a toolbox of things that you can go out into the market with and actually engage people and see where you can get traction.
Yeah. Now, Rudy, I think you've got some pretty good clarity from the northeastern states on where they stand. So, but what role do they play, and also, federal policy? Is that important for you?
So. For the most part, I think in the U.S. right now, the states are leading the way on this. It really isn't the federal government. It's really the states are leading the way. The states are doing solicitations, making sure they're getting offshore wind. So the states are leading the way, and they haven't really been hampered by the federal government really not showing up to the party in this case. Yet, exactly. Just speaking about the U.S., we're UK and U.S. business, like I said, states are really leading the way, particularly in the Northeast. I agree with everything Dany said around government setting the rules, setting incentives. But as someone who has to then deploy a lot of capital and build this and hopefully make a return on that capital, need policy durability, I'll call it for lack of a better term. Once a policy is in place, we need to let it ride through so we can make some planning decisions, actually build some things, and really take advantage of making those goals and hitting those goals. So we need policy durability is key. And the last point I would make is, I think we talked about, and the other panel talked about carbon pricing as well. Absolutely support carbon pricing. We also have to make sure it's implemented the right way, meaning A, it's phased in because it could be a big price shock to many consumers, right? And then B, make sure whatever revenues that are collected from that carbon tax or carbon price is actually used to reinvest in R&D for clean tech and not anything else. So support it, but it's equally important how you execute that as well.
Gayle, your perspective.
Okay, so there's been a lot of talk about the United States, and it makes sense, very state-led. Our state of Minnesota is really advancing significantly towards carbon-free electricity sourcing. We have operations in Texas and a number of other states which are also making good progress and giving us nice opportunities to address our footprint in the U.S. It is a little bit more complicated when you start going out country by country, because if you think the U.S. has independent states, the countries outside the United States are wildly independent. And, we have significant footprints in multiple locations in China, across Latin America, across Europe, Middle East, even Africa. And with those, we have a strong government affairs organization that partners with governments around the world on a lot of different issues. This is one of the topics that we make sure that they have at their ready and they're happy to talk about. It's something that we look at when we're selecting location decisions through our supply chain. We want to select sites that are capable from a renewable energy perspective, as well as a water sourcing perspective, energy in general sourcing, and looking out for things like climate change. So we're taking it state by state, country by country, and then trying to keep the big picture in mind as well.
So with the moment that we have left, I would love for each of you to just share one thing you're going to do next week. You've come here, you've been here, by the time you get there, you will have been here all week, you will have absorbed everything. So what one thing that will you be doing tomorrow first when you get back to the office? Dany, can I start with you?
Let me think about it.
What about a big takeaway? Is there anything that you've walked away from at this conference that you really feel like?
Actually, this morning I was very impressed by one quote from Japan's team. That's IE100 and the EP100 is our passport to the world. I think this is exactly what we want to say. It's not for a company to be a responsible citizen, or to be a responsible company, or to be a responsible country. Is our password to the world.
Great. Angie.
I think it's working in our supply chain. I mean, as we mentioned, we're 100% of our needs in the US, we're 16% globally, we're 50% contracted globally. So we have a path to get there, at least for 50% today. But it's our supply chain where 80% of our emissions lie outside of our control. So it's working with suppliers, it's working in that transportation space. I think there's a huge unlock coming in transportation for us. We ship a lot of beer, we make a lot of beer, we ship a lot of beer. So I think that transportation space as well in our supply chain.
Rudy, you're up.
We have a large natural gas business looking at ways of how do we decarbonize that. So I want to take away and say, are we doing enough to incent developers to develop more renewable natural gas projects that we can then contract and take all the output from?
Gayle.
We're at 1/3 of our global electricity today is from renewable sources. So good there, still lots more to do. I think one of the things that I took away a lot this week is really about the science-based targets and how we can get there faster than we've ever dreamed of. The comment at the opening ceremony about impossible is not a definition, it's a dare. I want to bring that back into our organization and really challenge across the organization to think bigger and faster and what more can we do.
Yeah, that's my big takeaway. I've been wanting companies to start really focusing on their supply chain for a while, and people are, I think, finally going to do it, and that is important. So please thank our panelists. Terrific. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much, everyone, and special thanks to Heather, who we seem to be working quite hard this week. So great. So we're going to move on to talk now about electric vehicles. Transport currently accounts for about 1/4 of the global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, and it's growing really fast. Our EV100 initiative is also growing fast. We have 60 members now committed to switching their fleets to 100% electric vehicles and or providing charging infrastructure for customers and staff. And one of the reasons that company fleets are so important is that in Europe, 2 out of 3 new vehicles are bought for company fleets. And what that means is they're driving the demand signal, stimulating the mass market, bringing costs down, but also really driving the second-hand market. So we need all of you to be buying electric vehicles so we can buy them in a few years' time ourselves personally. So all of that goes to this big market stimulation for EVs. Our next panel is going to talk about that, but before we do that, we're going to have some inspiration. I'm going to introduce Lucas Di Grassi, who is a Formula E champion and a driver for Audi Sport ABT Scheffler, and he's going to tell us about how the technology has been developing. Lucas, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Lucas Di Grassi. I'm a racing driver. I was born in Brazil, and I'm also a UN ambassador for clean air. And you can imagine what a racing driver is doing here in Climate Week in New York. So I started my career with a dream. I was a kid. My dream was to race cars, to drive in Formula One. I did that. And but as my career progressed, I saw a clear trend that electric cars would be the norm. Electric cars would be, they are more efficient, they are better for the environment, they are better for economics, they are better for operations cost. So in 2012, we decided to create the most advanced racing series with electric motors. So Formula E was created. Today, Formula E is a success. There are more than 10 manufacturers, more than IndyCar, more than NASCAR, more than F1 combined. So all the manufacturers are supporting this electric shift. And I would like to say, first, congratulations to the panel which was behind me, before me. Very interesting on energy production. But one of the main points that people don't talk about electric cars is that it's about air pollution. So electric cars, regardless of the energy source, you can say that the transition for renewables will take time, will not take time, some countries will adopt it, but the most important is that where people live, electric cars, they don't pollute. The emissions, even if they are the same, they are not. Electric cars are more efficient, even energy coming from a thermoelectric. Even if they are the same, you're not emitting these gases where people breathe, where people live. So electric cars will change massively the quality of lives and the cost for governments in subsidy for pulmonary diseases in any country. I'm doing myself a research together with UN about air quality in different cities, from São Paulo to London to Delhi and other places. And my message is that from logistics to micromobility, the future, faster than we expect, it will be electric. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Great. So, in case you were relaxing, it's time for your third question before we move on to the final panel. So, we're going to be talking about the rise of electric vehicles, and our question is, when will you switch your car for an EV? So, you already own one, in a few years' time, in quite a long number of years' time, or you don't own a car or never. Those are your choices. Get back on the app, please, and pick your choice from there. And I'd like to introduce our next panel. So we have Terry Slavin, the editor from Ethical Corporation, Jim Massey, Sustainability Strategy and Engagement from AstraZeneca, Hendrik Rosenthal, the Director of Group Sustainability for CLP Group, Michael Lightfoot, Chief Corporate Affairs Officer for LeasePlan, and Christine Weydig, Director, Environmental and Energy Programs, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Please welcome all of you to the stage.
Sitting.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us for what will certainly be the best of today's events, I'm sure. I'm the editor of Ethical Corporation, and if you don't know us, we do deep dives into the biggest sustainability issues facing business every month. And in November, we're looking again at transport, which is a perennial issue for us. So this is really relevant to me. Adair Turner said yesterday that in order to get to net zero carbon by 2050, we have to completely electrify road transport. And that's a huge ask. 1/3 of 1% of cars that are currently on the road are electric. And the IEA is predicting that that will grow to between 4 and 19% of the global fleet by 2030, but that obviously depends on policy decisions by governments. So it's the governments that are literally in the driving seat about how fast this is going to scale. And yet, only 8% of NDCs actually include a specific reduction target for transport. So it's the private sector that's really, it's really driving things here now, and it's great to be able to talk to here 4 members of Climate Group's e-mobility initiative, EV100. Now, member companies of EV100 have switched over 10,000 vehicles so far, but they're committed. The commitments so far are for 300,000 by 2030, but they're looking to get lots more companies and to get to the millions by 2030. So. I guess I'm going to start with Jim. We saw Novo Nordisk join EV100 yesterday, but AstraZeneca was there first. You're the first pharma company to join. Just wanted to ask, what are the economics of allowing you to do so, and where in your organization did that impetus come? Pressure from shareholders, from employees, saying you should be acting on your purpose as a healthcare company?
It's an interesting question because I've been listening. Every panel has been talking about the incentives. And as the global head of strategy for sustainability, that never came into conversation. Now, I guarantee you my finance department is taking benefit and figuring it out. But whenever I went to our executive team and we were talking about our global footprint and our greenhouse gas emissions, we had a pie chart of every area, and fleet was 10%. I'm proud to say it's now 7% 1 year after having that conversation. So I think that it's about the conversation being had at the right levels, and then I'm going to answer the second part. Where is it coming from, right? It's coming from both my executives as well as our stakeholders. And I want to be very clear on who the stakeholders are. It's our employees and our patients. Lucas, you did a great job. As a healthcare company, people always ask, why are you talking about the environment? And we have, as one of our most material matters, the impact of the planet's health on human health. They're interlocked. And so we're concerned about the fleet that we have of our sales reps driving in to communicate with doctors' offices, and they need to be electric because the air, if you're in an urban area, you're breathing unhealthy air. We're a respiratory, innovative company. We can't be adding to the problem that we're trying to help solve in the global community. So stakeholders, from employees, our patients, and our executives is where this is coming from. And I'm sure that there are others in the company who can tell you about the tax benefits and all of those. The decision was made because it's the right thing to do. And unequivocally, we want to be leaders in sustainability, and this is how we bring the two together.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Hendrik now. CLP is the largest investor-owned power business in Asia. So you've got power, you're a utility in Hong Kong, China, India, Taiwan, Australia. Climate Group's seeing a huge interest from energy companies in electrifying their fleet. They've got 17 utilities now signed up to EV100. Why do you think this is? And given that CLP is actually a coal producer, you're a good person to answer that question I have of whether our electricity supply is actually green enough to ensure that EVs are really reducing carbon emissions.
Sure. Maybe just to clarify, so we're an electric utility. We don't produce coal.
Okay.
We generate electricity, and our primary business is in Hong Kong. And we've been present there for over 100 years, supplying a reliable source of electricity for the territory. But we also have since expanded across the region in China, India, and Australia with a mixed portfolio. We have significant investments in nuclear power. We have gas in our portfolio, and we have certainly still have coal. Of course, our strategy of the last 10, maybe 15 plus years has been expanding our renewables portfolio. So from a generation perspective, we are very much on track to decarbonize the electricity that we provide to the market. In terms of switching to, we have about 1,000 vehicles in our fleet. So it's quite small relative to some of the other members. But having said that, for us, it wasn't a difficult decision to make. Climate Group was kind enough to come to me to ask whether we could join, and it was a relatively easy sell. I report to a committee, the Sustainability Executive Committee, which is made up of the CEO and a bunch of other C-suite. But when I showcased the EV100 program, it was probably a 5-minute discussion. Of course, we should join. This is something we believe in terms of electrifying transport. We're also a member of the Energy Transition Commission. So what Lord Adair-Turner said yesterday very much rings true for us. We believe in electrifying transport, electrifying industry. This is what we need to do to decarbonize our societies, really, our economies. So transport is a big piece for that. And if I would just to illustrate for Hong Kong, where we have our biggest operations, switching to electric vehicles reduces the carbon intensity of driving about 40 to 60%. That's based on a fuel mix currently of about 50% coal. Now, having said that, the government of Hong Kong, so in Hong Kong, the way we are set up is we do as we're told by the government in terms of how we're generating electricity. There's not much choice for us in the sense that we can just say we're switching everything to nuclear or build more renewables. There's a scheme of control agreement that is a contract essentially for us to work with government. And they have, in a recent month actually, launched a public engagement to ask everyone, what is it that we should do to decarbonize to 2050? And how do we get to net zero was one of the questions for Hong Kong by 2050. What's really come clear, even from the engagement document that was published at the time, is that even the government realizes that for us, or for Hong Kong to come to net zero, we need to have zero emission vehicles as part of that mix. Of course, the generation of electricity itself has to be zero carbon as well, but that also means the vehicles, and that includes all the vehicles. So we're very much supportive of that, and we try to do our part in terms of supplying charging infrastructure for Hong Kong. Currently, it's free. So I'm one of the 6%, I guess, on your survey just now. I actually went out and bought my own electric vehicle. Company didn't supply me one, but I spent a lot of, a bit of extra money in terms of purchasing. But over time, as you drive and as you go through the maintenance cycles, it does equalize in terms of cost. So it's a no-brainer for us, actually, from an electric utility perspective. It is our product at the end of the day. We hope everyone should, everyone should use more of it, and it does actually, at the end of the day, reduce carbon intensity. And particularly as we switch to more renewables in the fuel mix and reduce reliance on coal, and that's all part of the energy transition.
Okay, we haven't actually talked about the results of the survey. Can you bring them up on the?
Most people
maybe
said
the next time it comes around.
2/3 said it was the next before
2025. So, Michael, Lease Plans, international leasing company, 32 countries. You're a founder member of EV100, and you've gone beyond just electrifying your own employee fleet, which you're looking 2021.
Yes, that's right.
You're committing to net zero emissions for your entire fleet of customers. That's 1.8 million vehicles.
1.9 now.
9?
We've gone up.
We've got some more. So now you hear net zero and you wonder, so how much of that is offsetting? How much of that is going to be offsetting?
Well, we imagine like a very small proportion, and that will really be to cover like the diggers and stuff like that in our fleet that are difficult to transition to completely electric vehicles, but it will be a very small portion, also because it's very expensive to offset your vehicles. And just to give you some idea about how it's going, like at Lease Plan, since we said that we wanted to go fully electric at EV100 2 years ago, I mean, at the time that could have been seen as a pretty wild statement, but the figures show that it's not a wild statement. So at our last count, at our Q2 figures, we saw that around 8% of new orders were pure EVs, and around 14% were what we call like alternative powertrains. So that includes pure EVs, but also hybrids and hydrogen vehicles. So you see the whole direction of travel is moving towards clean vehicles. Now, why is that the case? Well, number one is because, as you said before, companies have their own sustainability strategies. They have to disclose how much carbon, that they are producing. You're going to have the implementation of the G20's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. It's a bit wonky, but in a few years, basically you will have to disclose the financial impact of your climate-related activities. So companies, particularly service companies that don't have big factories, see that their fleet is a big part of their overall emissions profile and will want to go electric. Customers, ordinary people, they want to go electric because it's sexy to drive an EV. I don't know how many people in here have actually driven an electric car. Raise your hand. See, our Formula One driver over here, he thinks it's sexy. They are, like, so it's a really great experience. But there's also like a very important reason about market access. So I imagine a lot of you have followed the debate around clean air zones in the United Kingdom, across Europe. Well, we just got some figures that show that across the European Union, there are now 250 low emission zones. So that's another really important reason why people want to go electric, and which is pushing the move into low emission vehicles. But I would also say TCO, or total cost of ownership, is also coming right down. So because the batteries are shrinking in size and becoming cheaper to produce, costs are falling. So what you're seeing, if you look at a total cost of ownership perspective, you're seeing that electric cars compared to petrol or diesel are now reaching price parity in some markets. So in Norway, in Sweden, almost in the United Kingdom, for sure in the Netherlands, but also in a lot of other European markets, you're seeing the EVs are now becoming cost competitive. So it's not just a good thing to do, it'll eventually become the right economic decision for reasons of market access and because of the total cost of ownership. It's not there yet, though. There are some big challenges to solve. So one is about the previous panel, the guy talked about policy durability. We have seen a very worrying trend where government incentives are put in place in some markets and then removed, which can really hurt EV adoption. They did that in the Netherlands, so if anyone here from the Dutch government is watching, that was a bad decision, and you guys should really reconsider that. So, you really, because a big part of the overall cost of an electric vehicle is taxation. You actually pay more tax on an electric vehicle on average than on other cars because the purchase price is higher, so you pay more in value-added tax. I mean, that's something that people really have to solve. The other one is a lack of public charging infrastructure. So before this panel, we actually released a call to action to the European Commission to say, guys, if you want to drive across Europe, it's very difficult because there's a real lack of public charging infrastructure. So that really needs to be fixed. They have the funds to do it. They just need to get on and make that happen. And the third thing is, we had a brief discussion about it before. One of the big issues we need to solve together is the health of the actual batteries in our electric cars. So we're part of the World Economic Forum's Global Battery Alliance. You will have all read in the newspapers that there's some legitimate concern around cobalt use in batteries. Now, people are coming together to solve this issue. We think you need to the big car manufacturers need to disclose where they're getting their cobalt from and how it's been mined to make sure that we have really clean batteries. It's really important to ensure that the industry maintains its social license to operate. So big picture, we see a lot of demand for EVs. We think that the cars are coming and that, that the costs are falling, but we also see some challenges that we need to put the right mindset on and address. And then I think that 2030 goal will be very reachable.
Yeah, and it's not only cobalt, though, it's lithium. And copper we heard from this morning as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, because the battery value chain is going to need to be expanded by 19 times what it is today, according to that report that was yesterday. Okay, I will turn to Christine. So you are in charge of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey's, and you are building and maintaining some of the most important transport assets in the U.S., including LaGuardia and JFK. EV in the air isn't something that's going to happen anytime soon, but on the ground, that's something that's a bit more doable. So how is the Port Authority incorporating EV charging into its operations to prepare for that future of electrified ground transport, at least?
Thank you. And actually, I'll give like a super brief explanation of who the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is, since those of you that aren't local probably don't know, but we do operate 5 of the New York, New Jersey region's airports, 8 of its seaports, 6 bridges and tunnels that connect New York and New Jersey, a subway system that connects New York and New Jersey, a couple of air train systems, the busiest bus terminal in North America, another transportation hub in New Jersey, the World Trade Center site and all of the commercial towers there, and some other big real estate in the region. And I should add that our Red Hook Marine Terminal was the location of the Formula E race here in New York, and I have yet to go, but next year we would really love to partner on some shared messaging around the importance of electrification of transport. And so our goals specifically as they relate to EV100 are really part of our broader sustainability goals. We have an 80 by 50 commitment, and in October our board embraced the Paris Climate Agreement, and we established a 35 by 25 goal and a roadmap to reach that goal. We had a dozen initiatives in that roadmap. A full 5 of them were related to electrification in some form. And so 2 of those goals are our EV100 goals. It's electrifying 100% of our airport shuttle bus fleets and 50% of our light duty fleet. And so, and I won't get into some of the variety in our fleet, but we do have a lot of sort of specialized equipment. We also have a big police force, so we have police vehicles, and so that's where we arrived at that 50% number. But as more models become available, we expect that we're going to be bumping that number up as well. But for us, as you were saying, Terry, it's ground transport is really the low-hanging fruit in our portfolio. So that 80 by 50 target includes aircraft emissions. It includes reducing emissions from ocean-going vessels, from the trucks that bring cargo to and from our ports. So for us, it was really important to take a stand on electrifying what's most readily electrifiable today in the transportation sector. And so for us to really engage our stakeholders to electrify some of that more difficult equipment and modes of transport, we really needed to show that we were walking the talk and investing our own dollars in electrifying our fleet. So that was really important to us. But as we look more broadly at the landscape of electrification, it's not just about our fleets and engaging our stakeholders on their fleets, but we also operate parking facilities at the airports and at the Midtown Bus Terminal and our New Jersey Transportation Hub. So part of this is really understanding what we need to then provide to the traveling public in these locations so that they have the ability to charge their vehicles, so that we're helping accelerate that transition by building out the infrastructure backbone that we already touched on in this discussion. But we have, when we look at our emissions, even when it comes to those Scope 3 emissions, the aircraft and the ocean-going vessels, attracted travel to our airports is actually one of the biggest sources of emissions for us. So all of those vehicles, whether it's an Uber bringing you to the airport or your Aunt Sue bringing you to the airport, we have to account for those vehicles, and we need to help accelerate the transition of those vehicles to electric. So we already have installed between 100 and 150 level 2 charging ports at our parking facilities, but we're also in the process of building a DC fast charging hub for hire vehicles that are visiting JFK Airport. And we expect to replicate that at our other airports as well, so that we can help attract some of those cleaner vehicles to our facilities and really make sure that they can charge quickly enough that they can get back out on the road and do their business. And so, we see our fleet electrification just as a first step in really kind of that beachhead approach that, some others in the space have already talked about, where this is the easy stuff. This is where we need to really electrify quickly and so prove out some of that technology so we can then have that tech transfer to some of the other areas that we're looking at, including electrification of ground support equipment at the airports, cargo handling equipment at the ports. The technology really exists. We just need to build up that demand and have some of that technology proven out in the field.
Okay. I'm just wondering what the take-up has been of all this infrastructure that you've got, the charging infrastructure, because there's been talk that the rollout of electric vehicles hasn't been as fast as expected.
Well, for me, I'm really eager to learn from others that probably have better forecasting than what we have available. But we've seen it really vary across the installations. So as an example, the charging stations at JFK and LaGuardia are pretty heavily utilized, whereas at Newark Airport, we're not seeing the same level of utilization. And for us, we don't see real granular statistics in terms of EV uptake in our region. Most of the statistics are either national or in certain cases even global, but the US market is definitely behind a lot of other parts in the world as it relates to EV uptake, and some of that is the types of vehicles Americans like to drive. Some of it is where the US OEMs are in terms of offering electric models. But hopefully with the right policies in place, we'll see that changing.
Okay, so you've all made commitments to electrify your vehicle fleets by no later than 2030. A few governments, including the UK, have set similar timelines to end combustion vehicle engine sales. So are governments pushing businesses to act here, or is it the other way around?
Well, I think,
start. Jim?
I think it's the other way around.
Mike.
It's okay. I mean, it's great that they create a macro policy environment that is supportive of the move to electric vehicles. Actually, but I think the real drive comes from ordinary citizens who want to breathe clean air and drive clean cars, from companies that benefit from the branding of this, of having clean vehicles. That looks good for them. The Royal Mail just released a fleet of cool electric postal delivery vans in the UK this week, and they're now seen as a design item. So they look weird, I think, but also pretty cool. But I think that the national government layer has not been so significant. I think where you're getting the most interest in action is at the supranational level, so the European Union's Air Quality Directive, and how that is being implemented by municipal authorities, because they get fined if they don't meet it. So actually that's where you're getting the government action. National governments, we've seen very patchy incentives there. So I think that the most action comes from ordinary employees and big businesses. That's certainly what we see.
Hendrik, what about in Hong Kong?
Yeah, in Hong Kong, it's been a bit of an interesting story over the years where the government did provide incentive for private cars where there was a waiver essentially of the first registration tax. And for the more expensive vehicles, that meant the price was reduced by half. And at the time, it was mostly Teslas that were available. And after a few years of that happening, the government was being criticized for subsidizing sports cars, if you like, luxury vehicles. So they dropped that waiver and they reduced it substantially. So now that more cars are on the market, I bought a Golf. I didn't get that full waiver, and my Golf was actually quite a bit more expensive than a regular petrol Golf, and I had to wait 9 to 10 months for it, actually. So that was, it's not quite there yet, but the government's angle is prices are changing. The price of electric vehicles is coming down. There's more vehicles coming on the market. We cannot be subsidizing luxury vehicles. So the market has to take its own initiative in a sense. So for private ownership in Hong Kong, what we do as a power company, we provide charging infrastructure. From my own experience, it's not difficult to charge your car. It's not cumbersome. It's not time-consuming. It is very doable. And from that perspective, I think for electric vehicles to grow in Hong Kong, it's just a matter of time, of more choices being available, and especially the normal type vehicles, not the luxury ones, the cheaper type, the more affordable type. if you need to drive in Hong Kong, which most people don't anyways, it depends where you live. If you live sort of in the outside areas, then driving in Hong Kong, you'll never go beyond 100 kilometers in a day. Range is not an issue. There's a lot of things that are just right in terms of ownership of electric vehicles in Hong Kong. So, but that's just Hong Kong. So in terms of the, I mean, from a EV 100 commitment, the way we see it for CLP, it's for passenger vehicles, when we talk to the business, the procurement people, sure, no problem. We'll have this sorted before 2025. All our passenger vehicles will be converted. The challenge is for the work-type vans that we have, the vans that go out and do the maintenance for transmission and distribution network. The procurement people feel at this point, no, we cannot find a suitable vehicle just yet that is fit for purpose. And that's also a large portion of what we own in Hong Kong in terms of vehicles. And then there's the larger ones with buses, etc., that we also have, and trucks. And they will review, every 2 or 3, every year actually, but we expect for that segment to change in the next 3 years or so in terms of more becoming available, so that we can make that transition and meet our commitment for 2030. But then when you look at other markets where we operate in, say, in India, the message we get clearly at this point from our own business is, no, it's quite limited. We have a lot of sites. We have a lot of wind farms that are remote. We need vehicles that can travel long distances, and we need vehicles that are fit for purpose. So at this point, we cannot yet say when we can make that transition, and we'll keep looking out for it. We'll keep looking out for the right vehicles. But the government itself, I mean, there was a few sessions this morning, I think, on the India market. Maybe you'd like to comment on that. Yeah. But at this point, it's a bit limited in terms of incentives that are being provided. Versus China, yeah, I mean, it's sort of on its own. It's quite advanced. I think there's probably a lot more electric vehicles there than in the US. I look forward to the day when I come back to New York and I can go jogging down Manhattan and not breathe in toxic fumes.
I was going to say, to that point, I think, you're talking about who's driving this. And, we're in the fourth industrial revolution where technology is adapting faster than we can. And so individuals are the most likely to adapt, and then business is the next slowest, and the last is government regulations. So if we're waiting for that to happen, we're in trouble. And I think it comes back to the data here that we need to be talking about. All of you are waiting. And so I'm not going to shame you, but why? And because there are cars available. I sold my soul. I'm an American, and I sold my soul. I'm in a Pacifica. It's a minivan. And I always told myself I was never going to do that. But it's plug-in hybrid. And so I filled up over the last 2 years 3 times. And I have clean solar at home, and at work we have chargers that do it. And so I think the important thing is we can sit here and talk about, every panel is ended with, what are you going to do? It's not what I'm going to do. I'm already in a plug-in hybrid. I'm going to ask you, what are you going to do? I need you to move it forward so that we can't sit back and claim it's someone else's problems. If in this room you aren't doing it, we're not going to get anyone else to. And it's fundamental in changing that. The other thing I think is really important about the data, 22% of the room don't have a vehicle. There are other trends that we have to start rethinking, and that's where my colleague, Ben in the room, when I talked about green fleet, he's like, come on, are you that old? What about green mobility? And I think that we need to be moving. The thing I'm excited about EV 100 is it's not limiting me to my fleet. It's challenging me to think about mobility. And so I'm challenging you, if you leave here, I need you in an EV. They're out there, no matter which market in which you're operating. We're in over 70 countries. There are some limitations. Go hybrid if you have to. But let's get to EV as soon as we can through demand, because we're the fastest to adapt during the fourth industrial revolution.
Christine, what's your take on this?
Well, I know we're probably running down the clock here, but that's a hard act to follow. I guess one thing, and I completely agree that we really need to be looking at at least as it relates especially to the passenger vehicle sector, the overlapping trends of shared, autonomous, and electric. And even when we look at the future of parking facilities, well, who's parking there? Is that your electric autonomous vehicle that you share with the rest of the city, and it's going to pick you up eventually when you get back from your flight? I mean, I think there's really a complete reimagining of mobility that needs to happen, but there are incremental steps in getting there, and I know the word incremental is probably a terrible word to use in this type of an environment, but really, I guess what I'm trying to say is, even when it comes to your shared mobility, one thing we're looking at when it comes to that attractive travel at the airports and having the infrastructure for them to charge, you should demand that Uber picks you up in an EV. And if you need to pay a little bit extra so that driver who might need to bear that additional cost can offset that additional cost, then that's something that as consumers, I think, there's a lot of power in terms of what your expectations are, even when it comes to the shared mobility space. One trend that I find absolutely horrifying is I'm a native New Yorker. I actually don't really drive. I didn't, but when I look at young people, even in the city now, they don't want to take the subway. They want to take an Uber, and those Ubers are not electric. And so there is a drift away from mass transit. Obviously, mass transit needs to be reliable, but we can't forget about the fact that there are some of these trends happening in the mobility space that really need to be counteracted.
I'm just wondering how many more questions I can ask here. Just plugging onwards. Looking forward to COP26, which is happening in Glasgow next year. What's the number one thing businesses that are, such as yourselves, are wanting to see in the next round of NDCs? Do you want to see targets ahead of more than those 8% of NDCs that actually have a transport target?
I want to check in because I think the clock is saying we're out of time. Is that correct?
Is it?
So maybe if somebody wants to address that once, and then we can.
I thought we had another 10 minutes.
Well, we need more commitments for net zero, right?
Yeah.
And carbon trading, universal carbon price, Article 6 needs to be sorted out. Hopefully we can make some progress this year. But let's see if it will take another year beyond that. Transport, electrification of transport, I think every government has to do its own part. And it is very local and very specific in terms of how to incentivize or not, or let the market decide of how we transition transport to electric vehicles. You want to add to that?
Not with time.
Okay. All right. That's been a great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've heard from businesses across the afternoon, and the business case for greater government ambition on climate change is very clear. And so now we're going to hear from the high-level champion for COP25, which is happening this year in Chile. Please welcome Gonzalo Muñoz.
Thank you, Helen. How are you?
Great. So we've been talking a bit about COP26 this afternoon, next year, but 3 months away, we've got COP25 in Chile. Are you ready? And are we on the right track?
Never ready, but always ready.
So let us know, how are we on track? What's the goal for December in Chile?
Well, there are many goals. As you might all know, my particular role is to mobilize non-state actors. Therefore, there are, of course, a lot of objectives that are related to the process that I'm not going to mention here, but you all know them. My particular role is all about what is happening in this room.
Yeah.
It is about how do we increase the impact that you have done as the climate group, and also what we have done together through the coalition that we promoted for the summit. I mean, that's probably one of the best conclusions for us, not only in terms of what happened in this week, but what we expect to happen also for COP25 and to COP26. We have delivered one particular agenda for everybody to join. So I want to also congratulate and thank you for all the work that you did on supporting the coalition and being part of that action ambition alliance. And we expect, therefore, that part of the success of COP25 would totally be related to how many new actors we add to that list.
Great. And we've been talking a lot this afternoon, and we've heard across the afternoon how businesses have really stepped up their game in the last 5 years since Paris. How's that going to play into the NDC revision process that we're going through now?
Well, it will depend on each country. So, of course, we have different types of countries. We have those countries that are highly committed and highly capable of delivering. And those countries are countries that, let's say, we from the non-state actor have to support, bring more evidence, celebrate, and help them achieve those goals as soon as possible. There are some other countries that we know have already committed, and for those that will be hard to finally deliver, then it's up to us to complement that effort. So how much we can collaborate from the business sector, from the subnationals, is our role to bring them the capability for them to deliver the NDCs. And then there are some other countries that are not necessarily in the list. In those two, we have some countries that are there, like maybe considering it. Okay, it's then for us to help them move towards joining the list. And then there's some other countries that we know it's going to take at least one period to consider it. So for those countries, then it's for our role to deliver the NDCs directly.
Yeah. And so I think we're hearing as well from businesses that, good policy and really helps them achieve their agenda, and they want to see more ambition. How can businesses show national governments that they want to see more ambition, they want them to step up? What can businesses do to help?
Well, we have set one particular common target. Okay, it's carbon neutrality in 2050. And in order to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050 for the whole world, there must be several pioneers that might achieve carbon neutrality right now, like prior, 2030, even 2040. So this is the moment in time for those leaders to show. We need mostly from the business sector. Fantastic if we have some national municipalities, regions that can also commit to delivering neutrality prior to 2050. But in the business sector, in many, many cases all around the world, there's no excuse why not to join and why not to lead and why not to find how much of that are opportunities, not only to reduce your emission, but reduce your cost, be more efficient, connect with better talent, make your company even more profitable while driving more lower financial cost, getting more attraction with your clients as customers through some narrative that will connect you within value. So there are many, many reasons why businesses can now take this as a relevant opportunity, why we know that leaders are the ones that take most of the opportunity, the ones that follow pay many times the cost of it. So this is the moment in time when we need business leaders to say, okay, if the world has to be neutral in 2050, I'm going to be neutral tomorrow.
And how can we get governments to then look at those businesses and say, right, if they're doing it, we will follow? What's the sort of process?
My experience is that that's what happens normally. I mean, I would say that most of the time, regulation doesn't occur while somebody in the government says, okay, today I'm going to deliver some sort of innovative regulation. Most of the time it's about checking what's happening in the ground, taking enough evidence to develop some sort of regulation. So what must happen in this moment, and I would say in many countries, in many regions, what is already happening, is that governments are taking into consideration what is happening in the ground. How many companies are already moving from fossil fuels to renewables? How many companies are suffering from reduction on water use? How many companies are really needing to connect with consumers who are low carbon based diet? So many connections that are actually allowing regulators to consider this as something that just have to be regulated. It is happening.
Fantastic. And so just the final thing, so we talk about Climate Week as the place where people can come together, particularly on the non-state actors, to talk about climate action. This is the last day here in the hub, so you get to give everyone a kind of closing message and send them on their way ready for COP. What do you want to say to everyone?
Well, thank you, first. We understand that this has been one of the most amazing weeks ever, right? We had not only the traditional UNA General Assembly, but then a climate summit, New York summit, New York Climate Week, and during this week, we have again delivered this list that includes all of us. So please, if you are already in the list, I celebrate and I thank you. If you are not there, you have 2 months to join. and if you join, as you will, come and celebrate that with us in Chile. If you consider that your carbon footprint while traveling to Chile is something that you won't, you're considering too much, then no problem, send a video. That's also acceptable. If you don't, well, I wait for you in Glasgow. But I mean, it's now. And not only if you're considering Glasgow, then come with 2 peers, okay? If you're coming alone, Chile is fine. But it's Glasgow, then with some other 2. There's no reason why not to join. We must celebrate that growing list every single day. We will see that growing. If you compare the graphs, and we saw that yesterday here, like the graph on the initiatives that have been delivered in the last COPs, how much of it was delivered in between COP14 and COP15. So that was a great momentum for the world. We are now living an amazing momentum, and we will see how much of that will grow in between 2019 and 2020, and we are part of that. We must bring those others that are still not connected to what's happening in this week, in this place, and deliver this to all of the world. I would say, and I would encourage the climate group and Under 2 Coalition to bring more actors from the global south. Let's bring some actors from the Caribbean region. Let's bring more actors from Africa and Latin America. We need them as well, and we need them to feel the energy that we have been feeling in this week here in New York.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm encouraged by how energetic you are with 2 months to go, and I hope that continues.
More than that, my mandate ends in COP26.
It does indeed, yeah, great. Well, good luck, and we'll see you over the next 15 months. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
So that is officially it. Closing the hub, but Climate Week continues. So thanks for all of you for coming to all the events over the last 2 days, all the energy you've brought. Lots of you here have been speaking and participating, and it's just been great to see you. And we're going to take these messages to COP25 and indeed COP26 and show that we really want to see increased ambition from national governments and that we stand behind governments who do that. So with that, go on your way. There are still hundreds of events happening across the city, and I hope you've had as good a time in the last couple of days as I had, and thank you all for being here.